I'm joined now by David Ignatius of The Washington Post, who's with the Defense Secretary in Munich, Germany, and David Makovsky, former executive editor of the Jerusalem Post. He's now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. David Ignatius, let me start with you. You've written of the zone of immunity that Iran is supposedly entering, which is pushing the timeline. What is that? What does that mean?
Israeli officials have described it to U.S. officials. The zone of immunity is the moment at which Iran has accumulated enough enriched uranium that it is able to proceed to build a nuclear weapon from that point on. In other words, if you don't strike before they enter that zone of immunity, they will be able to construct the bomb and you won't be able to stop it. This is a concern in part because of very deep Iranian bunkered facilities near Qum that Israeli weapons probably could not reach. U.S. weapons might be able to reach them, which is why the U.S. timeline is somewhat different. The U.S. could wait longer before attacking until it saw evidence that the Iranians were actually making a bomb, that is to say, after they'd entered this zone. The Israelis think they can't wait, and they don't want to depend on the U.S.
David Makovsky, zone of immunity or not, given the way the Iranian system is scattered, well protected, would a military strike be effective at halting it?
Well, I think they believe in Israel that it would be. I was just there last month, and there's an active debate at the top among the cabinet people and the top security people. They're pretty convinced they could attack, but David Ignatius got it exactly right. Ehud Barak gave an interview in November, didn't get a lot of play, where he said basically you got 6 to 9 months until that they enter the zone of immunity, meaning that they have such well-fortified sites underground that there's a certain point that you just can't attack. So this is kind of a year of decision for them in Israel. It's a kind of now or never kind of element. It's not something they are yearning to do. They would hope that sanctions work, but they feel they have to make a decision amid suboptimal conditions. They don't have America's military capability, and their window closes quicker than the United States.
Well, you mentioned the sanctions working. David Ignatius, is that a big gamble for Israel, not to wait to see if the sanctions, which by widespread reporting are really cutting deep in Iran, do have time to work?
The United States government believes that it is a mistake for Israel to consider launching or launch such an attack. They believe that the sanctions are working, that there's an international coalition that's been assembled that's increasingly aggressive in trying to stop this Iranian program. They worry that a unilateral Israeli strike would blow that coalition apart. So they think this is a bad idea. I want to be very clear about that. Also, I should make clear that U.S. officials don't believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu has yet made the decision to strike. They just think that there's a strong likelihood that he will make that decision.
David Makovsky?
I agree. I think there's two people kind of leading the effort. It's Defense Minister Ehud Barak. I'd say a quarter step behind him is the Prime Minister Netanyahu. And these are two people who would prefer their first preference, sanctions work. This issue solved peacefully. Everyone's happiest. The second preference, I think, would be that Israel could back off and that the United States, that has greater capability and a longer timeline, could deal with it. But because they're not sure of what the U.S. would do if sanctions don't prove to be decisive, they're left with their third choice, which is that they might have to strike earlier because of their closing window. But, you know, what I've learned if you look at the history where there's 2 other incidents where Israel have hit nuclear sites, one of Iraq, one of Syria. In each case, there were divisions. And at the time when Israel hit the Osirak reactor of Saddam Hussein, the head of the Mossad was against it. The head of military intelligence was against it. But a determined prime minister brought his cabinet around, even though it took a little longer, frankly, until they made a decision. David Ignatius got exactly right. They haven't made a decision yet. But I think that Barak and Netanyahu would prefer that somehow this is taken care of otherwise. But they're fearful is they're going to be left holding the bag because unless they have greater understandings with the United States, when Leon Panetta says this is a red line for America, if Iran does such and such on their nuclear program. I think if there was a greater understanding what that red line was and what the consequences of an American response would be, I think the United States could reshape that debate in Israel, even though it's at a late phase, and the Israelis would back off. So I don't think we should speak about it as an inevitability. I think it's just rather a strong possibility.
David Ignatius, greater understandings between Israel and the United States. Is there also a risk, given that the United States, by your reporting, is discouraging Israel at this point, that any unilateral action by the Israelis would drive a wedge in that close bilateral alliance?
Yes, I think that's one of the dangers that the Israelis need to consider. This administration, as I understand it, has made clear to Israel that we don't think this is wise, that we don't think it's in our interest or Israel's, and that we think the unintended, unanticipated consequences could be very damaging across the region. And so I think Israel does need to consider whether its crucial strategic relationship with the United States would be seriously negatively affected if it went ahead and did something despite these strong arguments against it from the United States. Again, Israel feels, this Israeli government, but I think every Israeli government feels that in the end it alone has to make decisions about how it's going to be secure. It can't depend on anybody else. And that's part of what I think we're seeing play out, is the pressure of Israel against its key ally, but this sense that in the end the Israelis have to be masters of their own fate.
Before we close, I'd like to hear from both of you about the cost-benefit analysis being made on both sides. If you only slow down and don't stop the Iranian program, but unleash military strikes, could the possibilities for Iranian retaliation, for destabilization in the region be so severe that the blowback's worse than what you accomplished with the attack?
Look, I think that's why there's divisions inside Israel, because they are concerned about regional consequences. I don't think they believe there's going to be a full-blown Middle East war as a result of this. The worst they see it would be that they have to deal with some retaliation from Iran, and there would be a Hezbollah northern border situation. They have to weigh the risks of action versus the risks of inaction. They see the risk of inaction, meaning you're going to have a nuclear arms race in the Middle East with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all wanting to counter the Iranian bomb. You will see a proliferation to non-state actors like Hezbollah, maybe some dirty bomb technology, that you will be emboldening rejectionists, you will be intimidating moderates. So they see this as a profound change in the balance of power. On the other hand, as you point out, there's risks of action. Where I would gently disagree with David Ignatius, respectfully, is that I don't think it's as much like the Zionist ethos of self-reliance. I think it's more like if there was a way to synchronize the clocks, I think Israel would certainly be welcome to it. They're aware of the risk, but their view is once Iran crosses the finish line, it's just going to be too late for anyone to do anything like North Korea.
David Ignatius, quick response?
Well, I think what bothers U.S. officials, what bothers me as an analyst and columnist, is that this is a roll of the dice. And the Israelis believe that the Iranian response would probably be limited, that their own casualties would be limited, that the effect on the global economy would not be severe, that this would pass as their strike on Iraq passed, as their strike in 2007 on Syria, a Syrian nuclear reactor passed. But it's impossible to know, and a roll of the dice with the consequences this high for everyone concerned bothers me. That's a risky way to make statecraft.
David Ignatius, David Makovsky. Gentlemen, thank you both.